The wind blew through the empty streets of Millbrook Falls with that ghostly whisper known only to small American towns. A sound carrying the weight of untold stories of lives that continue spinning in silent circles, far from the world's spotlight. It was early autumn, and the leaves were beginning to take on that golden reddish hue that painted the landscape with an almost palpable melancholy, as if nature itself knew that something was about to change in that forgotten town, nestled among mountains and dense forests. Heavy clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain, and the late afternoon light filtered through them in oblique rays that seemed like divine fingers pointing to the earth, searching for something or someone long lost in the shadows. On the eastern edge of town, where houses began to space out further and civilization gradually gave way to wilderness, there was a property everyone knew, but few dared mention in casual conversation. It was a small, weathered wooden house with peeling paint on its exterior walls and a roof that had certainly seen better days. The front garden, once perhaps carefully tended, now grew wild and disordered, with tall grass swaying in the wind and shrubs spreading uncontrollably, as if the house itself were trying to hide from the world, to camouflage itself among the vegetation so as not to be found. A wooden fence surrounded the property, several boards missing or hanging by only a rusty nail, swaying in the wind in a hypnotic and unsettling rhythm. In the silence of that afternoon, the creaking of the old wood was the only audible sound, repetitive like a broken clock marking a time that no longer exists. Inside that house lived Simon Thatcher, a man the whole town knew only as the Silent Veteran. That fellow who returned from some distant and terrible place. One of those places that appear in the news with unpronounceable names, where young Americans are sent to fight wars that most people in Millbrook Falls could barely locate on a map. Simon was 42 years old, but his face told the story of someone who had lived at least two lives. One before leaving, when he was still the smiling son of the Thatchers, known for his talent in high school football and for that gentle way of greeting everyone on Main Street. And another after returning, when his eyes acquired that empty depth that only those who have seen indescribable things can carry. They were eyes as grey as steel, but not the cold, shiny steel of a new knife. They were old steel, worn by use, stained by things that neither time nor all the water in the world can wash away. At that particular moment, Simon sat on his wooden porch in an old rocking chair that had belonged to his grandfather, a mug of already cold coffee between his calloused hands. He didn't drink the coffee. He merely held the mug as if it were an anchor, keeping him grounded in the present, in the here and now, preventing his mind from wandering to those dark places it always wanted to go when he let his guard down. His hands were large and strong, with scars that traced maps of pain across his tanned skin. A white line across the knuckles of his right fingers, another irregular mark on the back of his left hand. Small dots that looked like old burns scattered across his forearms. He wore a faded plaid flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, jeans worn at the knees, and work boots that were at least 10 years old. His posture was erect even when relaxed, that kind of military posture that never truly leaves a soldier. A rigidity in his spine that speaks of discipline, forged through years of training and survival. The silence around them was almost absolute, broken only by the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional distant call of a raven. This silence was not peace. It was the kind of silence charged with tension, like the calm before the storm, like the suspended moment between lightning and thunder when the whole world seems to hold its breath. Simon knew this kind of silence well. He had experienced it countless times in distant deserts, in those interminable moments before a mission begins, when you are hidden in a position waiting for the signal to advance, and each second drags on like an eternity. It was the silence that precedes violence, death, the irreversible transformation of everything you know. And even here, in this quiet country town, in this isolated house where he should be safe, this silence haunted him like a ghost that refuses to accept that the war is over. His eyes scanned the landscape before him with that hyper-vigilant attention that never quite switched off. He noticed every movement in the trees, a squirrel leaping from branch to branch, a bird landing on a bush, leaves being carried by the wind. His brain automatically catalogued potential threats, escape routes, points of cover, even knowing rationally that there was no danger whatsoever in that wild garden. It was an instinct that had become second nature, so deeply ingrained in his nervous system that it would be easier to rip his own heart from his chest than to turn it off. This was the curse he had brought back from those distant places, the inability to simply exist without constantly assessing threats, calculating probabilities of danger, mentally preparing for conflicts that would never come. It was exhausting to live like this, and the weariness was written on every line of his face, in the dark shadows under his eyes, in the way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible but crushing weight. The town of Millbrook Falls continued its indifferent routine beyond the broken fence of its property. There were about 8,000 inhabitants in that small patch of civilization, nestled among the inland mountains. People who woke early to work in the local sawmills, in the small furniture factory that was the largest employer in the region. On the farms that dotted the surrounding countryside, they were mostly good people. The kind of hard-working Americans who form the invisible backbone of the country, who pay their taxes, go to church on Sundays, know their neighbors by name, and leave their doors unlocked at night. But even among these good, simple people, Simon felt like an outsider, a ghost walking among the living, someone who had seen and done things that placed him in a different category of human being. He could see the stares when he occasionally went into town. That mixture of curiosity, pity, and discomfort that people tried to disguise with polite smiles and quick nods before looking away. He was a walking reminder of things they preferred not to think about: war, violence, sacrifice, the real price some pay so that others can live in peace. A louder creaking of the fence caught his attention, and his muscles tensed instantly, his whole body going into alert mode in a fraction of a second. His right hand reflexively moved toward his hip, where there was no weapon but where for years there had been a pistol as familiar as an extension of his own body. It was just the wind rustling a particularly loose plank, but his heart was already racing, adrenaline coursing through his veins, his breathing becoming shallow. He closed his eyes and forced himself to breathe deeply. 1, 2, 3 long controlled breaths, the technique the VA hospital therapist had taught him to manage episodes of hypervigilance. "You're home, Simon. You're safe. There are no enemies here. The war is over." But even as he repeated those words mentally, part of him didn't believe them. Part of him was still there, in that foreign country whose name he now avoided pronouncing, where the line between friend and foe was as thin as a hair, and death could come from any direction at any moment. The sun began its final descent toward the horizon, tinging the sky with shades of orange and purple that were almost painfully beautiful. Simon watched the sunset with an expression of deep melancholy, remembering other sunsets elsewhere. Some observed from watchtowers in fortified military bases, others seen through the sights of a rifle while awaiting orders. Some witnessed in stolen moments of tranquility that seemed all the more precious for their rarity. There was one sunset in particular that haunted his memory. The last one he had seen with his entire team, that night before the mission that would change everything. They were sitting on the roof of an abandoned building, 6 men who had become brothers through fire and blood, sharing military rations and making silly jokes while the sky burned red and gold. 24 hours later, 3 of them would be dead. And Simon, one of the survivors, would carry his memories like stones tied around his neck, constantly pulling him towards dark depths from which he struggled daily to emerge. The solitude of his current existence was self-imposed, but no less suffocating for it. Simon had deliberately isolated himself, building walls around himself higher and more impenetrable than any military fortification. He woke up alone, spent his days alone working small carpentry and repair jobs that allowed him to survive without needing to interact much with other people, and went to sleep alone, often waking up in the middle of the night drenched in cold sweat, shouting for comrades who could no longer hear him. There was no woman in his life, no relationship that extended beyond basic business transactions. His parents had died while he was stationed overseas. His father, from a sudden heart attack. His mother a few months later from something the doctors called respiratory complications, but which Simon knew was a broken heart. He hadn't even been able to return for the funerals, trapped in a combat zone from which there was no escape. This guilt joined the many others he carried, a collection of regrets and sorrows that grew year after year like layers of sediment, forming solid rock in his soul. As darkness began to envelop the landscape, transforming the trees into black silhouettes against the darkened sky, Simon remained motionless in his chair. A statue of a man who was once alive, but now exists in some intermediate state between present and past, between peace and war, between the living and the departed. And in that heavy autumn silence, with the wind carrying the scent of distant rain and decaying leaves, something was about to shatter the tranquil but fragile surface of his carefully controlled existence. Something from the past, or perhaps from the future, or from that place where past and future meet in the present moment and demand that a man choose who he will be when the world crumbles around him once more. Simon Thatcher's days unfolded with an almost military predictability. A rigid routine he had built like a fortress against the chaos that constantly threatened to invade his mind. He invariably woke at 5:45 a.m., even without an alarm clock. His body had been trained during years of military service to wake before dawn, and this habit refused to leave him even after so many years back in civilian life. The first thing he did, still lying in the narrow bed he occupied alone in a Spartan room, decorated only with an old wardrobe and a chest of drawers, was to mentally check his body for aches or tension accumulated during the night. His back frequently complained, the result of years carrying heavy equipment and sleeping in precarious conditions in combat zones. His right knee had been permanently damaged since the day his unit was ambushed, and he had to run 3 kilometers carrying a wounded comrade while bullets whizzed around him. After getting up, Simon would go to the bathroom, where he would perform his morning routine with mechanical efficiency, washing his face with cold water to fully wake him up, shaving with an old razor that had belonged to his grandfather, brushing his teeth while his eyes avoided his own reflection in the stained mirror. He didn't like looking at himself for too long. The man he saw reflected was a stranger wearing his face, someone he barely recognized as the person he once was. Then he would dress quickly, always practical and neutral clothes, nothing flashy, nothing that would attract attention. Jeans, a work shirt, sturdy boots. He would then go down to the small kitchen, where he would prepare a strong, simple coffee, without sugar or milk, and eat something equally basic: toast, scrambled eggs, sometimes oatmeal. Food was fuel, nothing more. He had lost the pleasure of savoring meals somewhere between military rations and memories of comrades who would never eat anything again. The town of Millbrook Falls slowly awoke around him as Simon began his workday. He had established a small, informal carpentry and general repair business, working mostly alone on projects that townspeople occasionally offered him. Fixing a rotting deck here, building a bookshelf there, repairing a storm-damaged fence. They were honest jobs that kept his hands busy and his mind partially distracted from the memories that constantly tried to surface. He was good at what he did. His tool skills had been honed during his military service, where he had learned to build and repair structures under extreme pressure and with limited resources. His clients appreciated the quality of his work, though few felt comfortable talking to him beyond the bare minimum. There was something in the intensity of his gaze, the economy of his words, the heavy silence that surrounded him like an aura, that made people feel uneasy. His interactions with the inhabitants of Millbrook Falls were minimal and carefully controlled. He knew Elizabeth Morrison, the woman in her 60s who ran the small grocery store on Main Street where he bought his weekly supplies. She would always try to strike up a conversation, ask how he was, comment on the weather or some local event, but Simon would respond with polite monosyllables that gently but firmly ended any attempt at a deeper connection. There was also Logan Carter, the owner of the hardware store, a man in his 50s, who was a Vietnam veteran and who occasionally looked at Simon with that expression of silent recognition that only those who have served can truly understand. Logan never pressed, never asked intrusive questions, just nodded when Simon entered his store and processed his purchases with quiet respect. It was the kind of interaction Simon could tolerate. No emotional demands, no expectations of intimacy. At night, after a day of physical work that left his body aching, but his mind a little less agitated, Simon returned to his isolated home where solitude awaited him like an old companion. He prepared a simple dinner, usually something that could be cooked in a single pot, and ate alone at the small kitchen table while the silence of the house pressed against him from all sides. Then he sat in the dimly lit living room where he tried to read books he couldn't really absorb or watched television without really seeing what was on the screen, just grateful for the background noise that filled the void. Drink was a constant temptation. He kept a bottle of bourbon in the kitchen cupboard, but he had made a pact with himself never to drink alone, never to use alcohol as a crutch to escape pain. He had seen good men destroyed by that road and refused to follow the same path. The invisible scars Simon carried were more debilitating than any physical injury. Nightmares came almost every night, transporting him back to those terrible moments he most wanted to forget. The sound of explosions, the screams of wounded men, the smell of blood and gunpowder, the faces of friends dying in his arms. He would often wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, body covered in sweat, disoriented as to where he was until reality slowly reasserted itself around him. The official diagnosis was severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but Simon rarely thought of it in those clinical terms. For him, it was simply the reality of his existence, the price he had paid for surviving when so many others did not. He attended monthly appointments at the VA hospital in the larger neighboring city. A 40-minute drive he reluctantly undertook, sat before a therapist who genuinely tried to help but whom he could never truly understand, and spoke the bare minimum necessary to maintain his benefits and medication. The pills they prescribed softened the sharp edges of his anxiety, but nothing truly healed the deep hole inside him where his soul used to reside. Simon Thatcher was born in Millbrook Falls on a cold March morning in 1983, the only child of Robert and Dorothy Thatcher, a couple who embodied everything good and decent about rural America. His father, Robert, worked at the local sawmill as a supervisor, a man with calloused hands and a generous heart who deeply believed in the value of honest work and personal integrity. His mother, Dorothy, was a teacher at the town's elementary school, known for her endless patience with difficult children and for making the best chocolate chip cookies anyone in Millbrook Falls had ever tasted. They raised Simon in a modest but loving home, where family dinners were sacred, where values like honesty, loyalty, and service to the community were taught not through sermons, but through daily example. Simon's childhood was marked by that almost magical quality that only small American towns can offer. Endless summers exploring the forests surrounding Millbrook Falls, with his inseparable group of friends, building tree forts, fishing in the creek that ran through the Harrison family property, playing baseball on makeshift fields until darkness forced them to return home. He was a naturally athletic boy, with physical coordination that stood out even among other active children. And this ability blossomed when he joined the Millbrook Falls High School football team. As a linebacker, Simon discovered that he possessed not only the necessary strength and speed, but also an instinctive ability to read the field, anticipate movements, and react with pinpoint accuracy. His coach, a Gulf War veteran named Coach Patterson, saw something special in him. Not just athletic talent, but character, discipline, and the ability to lead by example. During his high school years, Simon was everything a young American aspired to be. He was popular without being arrogant, intelligent without being pretentious, strong yet kind. His grades were solid, especially in math and history. Though he had never been an exceptional student, he was the kind of student who did his work conscientiously, but whose true passions lay outside the classroom. He dated Victoria Hayes throughout his senior year, a brunette with a bright smile who dreamed of studying nursing, and who saw in Simon the kind of good, reliable man with whom she could build a future. They spoke vaguely about marriage after college, about settling down in Millbrook Falls, or perhaps a larger nearby town, about raising children who would grow up with the same values and opportunities they had received. It was a simple dream, but it was theirs, and it seemed perfectly attainable in those golden days before reality intervened. Simon's decision to enlist in the United States Army after graduation didn't stem from economic desperation or a lack of other options. He could have gone to State Community College on a partial football scholarship. He could have started working at the sawmill with his father, eventually taking on a leadership position. But something deeper called to him, a sense of duty that had been cultivated not only by Coach Patterson, who frequently spoke about the meaning of military service, but by a lifetime growing up in a community that revered veterans and valued sacrifice for the nation. His paternal grandfather had served in World War II, landing in Normandy on D-Day and surviving the Battle of the Bulge. That quiet, dignified man whom Simon had only known in the last years of his life rarely spoke about the war. But when he did, His words carried a weight that young Simon instinctively respected. There was a framed photograph in the Thatchers' living room showing the grandfather in uniform, young and serious, looking directly at the camera with an expression that mixed determination and something indefinable that Simon would only later recognize as the foreknowledge of what was to come. When Simon announced his decision to enlist one April afternoon, 2 months before graduation, his family's reaction was complex. His father was quiet for a long moment, then rose from the kitchen table, hugged his son tightly, and simply said, "I'm proud of you, young man, but promise you'll come home." His mother wept, not tears of disappointment, but of deep, instinctive maternal fear, that terror all mothers feel when their sons choose dangerous paths. Victoria tried to hide her despair behind a brave smile, but Simon saw the pain in her eyes, the fear that the future they had planned together might dissolve like mist under the morning sun. He promised them all that he would be careful, that he would do his duty and return, that everything would be all right. These were promises made with absolute sincerity, but made by a young man who had no way of knowing what kind of hell awaited him, what kind of irreversible transformation he would undergo, that the person who returned would be fundamentally different from the one who left. The final days before leaving for basic training were bittersweet, saturated with that special quality that final moments always possess. When we know something is ending forever, Simon spent long hours with his parents, memorizing the details of their home, the smell of his mother's kitchen, the sound of his father's voice reading the newspaper on the porch at dusk. He took Victoria to the lookout point in the hills above town, where they could see all the lights of Millbrook Falls twinkling in the valley below like terrestrial stars. And there they made plans and vowed eternal love, while neither of them uttered the real fear that this might be a permanent goodbye. On the eve of his departure, the community organized a small barbecue in his honor in the town park. And Simon was surrounded by people who had known him since childhood, all wishing him safety, all proud, but also frightened by what his choice meant. Coach Patterson handed him a small pocket Bible he had carried during his own time in service, its pages yellowed and with notes in the margins, and said, "This kept me alive and sane. I hope it does the same for you." Simon kept that Bible in his uniform pocket and would carry it through 3 shifts of combat, through scorching deserts and freezing nights, through moments of utter terror, and it would be with him on that terrible day when everything would change forever. Hell has many faces, and Simon Thatcher learned to recognize each one during his 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan. The idealistic young man who left Millbrook Falls with hope in his eyes and promises on his lips was systematically deconstructed and rebuilt into something different, something harder, darker, something that functioned perfectly as a war machine, but struggled to remember how to be human. The first tour had been relatively quiet, mostly routine patrols and security operations in already pacified areas. Simon still wrote long letters to Victoria, still called his parents whenever possible, still believed that he was making a positive difference in the world. But it was during the second tour that cracks began to appear in his psychological armor, when his unit was transferred to a particularly volatile province, where the insurgency burned with fierce intensity, and the line between civilian and combatant was impossible to discern. The men Simon served with became more than friends. They were brothers, forged in the kind of brutal intimacy only combat can create. There was Hudson Mitchell, a tall, gangly Texan who cracked terrible jokes at the most inappropriate moments, and whose infectious laughter could light up even the darkest situations. There was James "Jimmy" Rodriguez from Los Angeles. Only 19, but already a veteran of a childhood on the streets that had prepared him for violence in ways no military training could replicate. There was Marcus Washington, a quiet guy from Detroit who carried a worn photograph of his newborn daughter, whom he had yet to meet in person, promising himself he would survive to see her grow up. And there was Sergeant Daniel Cole, leader of his squad, a veteran of multiple tours of duty who treated his men with a mixture of professional toughness and paternal care, always checking if everyone had eaten, if they were hydrated, if their weapons were in proper condition. These men became Simon's entire world. They ate together, slept in claustrophobic proximity, and entrusted their lives to each other daily. The mission that would change everything took place on a sweltering July afternoon, when the thermometer read 43 degrees in the shade, and the sun transformed the Afghan desert into a hellish landscape that distorted vision with waves of heat. Simon's squad was ordered to investigate reports of insurgent activity in a small mountain village, a place so remote it barely appeared on military maps. The approach was tense but not unusual. They had conducted dozens of similar patrols. But something was different this time. A feeling in the air that Simon couldn't define, but that made every nerve in his body vibrate with alertness. Sergeant Cole felt it too. Simon saw it in the way his eyes constantly scanned the terrain, in the rigidity of his shoulders. They entered the village in standard tactical formation, weapons ready but not pointed, trying to balance readiness with the appearance of non-aggression that might gain the cooperation of civilians. The attack came from multiple directions, simultaneously. A coordinated ambush with deadly precision that transformed the silent afternoon into utter chaos in the blink of an eye. Bursts of AK-47 fire ripped through the air, bullets ricocheting off adobe walls, raising clouds of dust that made it impossible to see clearly. Simon threw himself behind a low wall, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it over the sound of gunfire, adrenaline flooding his system like liquid fire. He returned fire in the direction of the flashes of gunfire he saw in the dark windows of the surrounding buildings, training taking over, as his conscious mind seemed to float somewhere above his body, observing everything with surreal detachment. He heard Sergeant Cole's voice shouting orders, coordinating responses, requesting air support over the radio. He heard Hudson yelling something unintelligible to his left, the constant staccato of automatic fire, the whistling of projectiles passing dangerously close to his head. And then came the explosion, an IED buried in the street that detonated as Jimmy Rodriguez rushed into position. The sound was deafening, a wave of physical pressure that threw Simon against the wall with enough force to empty his lungs. As the dust began to settle and his ears stopped ringing enough to hear again, he heard different screams now, not of combat, but of pure agony. Simon forced himself to look and saw Jimmy on the ground, or at least part of him, blood spreading in a pool that grew impossibly fast under the brutal sun. Hudson was running toward him, braving continuous enemy fire, dragging the mutilated body to cover while shouting for a medic. Simon saw all this, but couldn't move, temporarily paralyzed, not by fear, but by something deeper, a sudden and terrifying realization that death was right there among them, that it had touched one of them and could touch any other at any moment, that all the bravery and training in the world meant nothing when their number was called. The fighting lasted another 20 minutes, that felt like 20 hours. When it finally fell silent and air support dispersed the remaining insurgents, 3 men from his squad were dead. Jimmy, who died before the medical helicopter even arrived. Marcus, who was shot in the neck during the retreat and bled to death despite desperate efforts to save him. And Sergeant Cole, who died covering his men's retreat, absorbing bullets that would otherwise have hit others. Simon survived physically unscathed except for a few cuts and bruises. But something inside him died in that mountain village whose name he now refused to pronounce. He carried the bodies of his friends to the evacuation helicopters, his hands sticky with their blood. His uniforms stained with the life essence of men who had been vibrant and alive hours before. And in that moment, as he looked at the body bags, Simon Thatcher stopped believing in anything, in mission, in purpose, in God, in justice, perhaps even in humanity. Tuesday morning began like any other in Simon's carefully structured routine. Waking before dawn, bitter coffee, preparing for another day of solitary work. He had scheduled repairs for the Harrington family's fence that week, a family who lived 3 miles down the road, and was loading tools into the back of his old Ford pickup truck when he heard the sound of an engine approaching down the dirt road leading to his property. It was unusual. Visitors were rare, and unannounced ones even rarer. He paused, instinctively tense, watching as a dust-covered grey sedan emerged from the bend between the trees. The car stopped in front of his house, and out stepped a woman Simon hadn't seen in almost 15 years, Victoria Hayes, though now she used a different surname he didn't recognize. She had changed in the ways that time changes all people. Shorter hair now, a few lines around her eyes, a maturity in her posture that the girl he had known didn't possess. But it was unmistakably her, that same intensity in her gaze, that same way of biting her lower lip when she was nervous. Victoria stood beside the car for a moment, that seemed to stretch indefinitely. Her eyes meeting his across the distance that separated them, and Simon saw something in her expression that made his stomach clench. Fear, despair, and something that looked very much like hope failing against impossible odds. "Simon," she said finally, her voice breaking slightly on the second syllable. "I know I have no right to be here. I know we haven't spoken in years, but I had no one else to turn to." Her hands trembled visibly as she pressed them against the side of the car, as if she needed physical support to remain standing. Simon descended the porch steps slowly, each step measured and cautious, part of him wanting to run in the opposite direction, while another part, a part he thought he had buried long ago, felt something stirring in his chest, some long dormant emotion trying to awaken. "Victoria," he said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply like someone preparing to plunge into deep water. "It's my brother," she said, the words now trickling out as if she feared losing courage if she didn't say them all at once. "Do you remember Hudson? He was 8 when you left. Now he's 23 and he's in trouble. Serious trouble, Simon. He's gotten involved with the wrong people. He owes money to people who won't take an apology, and they said they'll kill him if he doesn't pay by Friday. It's $50,000 that we don't have, that we'll never have." The mention of Hudson's name made Simon take an involuntary step back. That name carried the weight of a ghost of another Hudson who died in a distant village, clutching his entrails in his hands while screaming for his mother. He forced that thought down, burying it in the depths where he kept all the memories he couldn't bear to examine. "And why did you come to me?" he asked, though he already knew the answer, already felt its weight settling on his shoulders like a leaden cloak. Victoria took a step toward him, tears now streaming freely down her cheeks. "Because you're the only person I know who could really do something about it. Because I've heard the stories about what you've become out there, about your abilities. Because even though you've changed, even though you can barely look at me now, I know that somewhere inside you, there's still the man I loved. The man who always protected the weak, who never shied away from doing what was right." Simon felt anger rising, not directed at her, but at the situation, at the universe that constantly conspired to drag people back to the places they were trying to escape. "Victoria, you know nothing about what I've become," he said, his voice harsher than intended. "You don't know what these abilities have cost you. You don't know how many nights I wake up screaming, how many times a day I have to convince myself that I'm no longer in danger, that the war is over. And you come here asking me to use exactly the part of me I try hardest to forget." But even as he spoke these words, he knew he had already lost, that the decision had already been made on some deep level that preceded logic or reason. Victoria moved closer, now only a meter from him, and he could see every detail of her face, marked by stress and sleepless nights. "I'm not asking you to go back to being that," she said softly. "I'm asking you to use that to save a life. My brother is just a boy, Simon. A stupid boy who made terrible mistakes, but he doesn't deserve to die for it." The word boy echoed in Simon's mind like a funeral bell. Jimmy Rodriguez was 19, technically an adult, but really just a boy, with tattoos that tried to look tough, but eyes that still held that innocence that true violence hadn't yet erased. Marcus Washington was 22, with a baby daughter he would never meet, dreams of going to college with the GI Bill when he finished his service. Boys, all of them, thrown into situations for which no training can truly prepare you. And now there was another boy, the brother of the only woman Simon had ever loved, teetering on the edge of an abyss that could swallow him whole. "Tell me everything," Simon finally said, resignation weighing heavily on his voice. "Who are these people? Where is your brother now? How much time do we really have?" Victoria nearly collapsed in relief, a sob escaping her lips as she began to explain the details. Her brother had become involved with methamphetamine dealers operating in the area, accumulated debts from gambling and drugs, threats that were becoming more specific and violent each day. As Simon listened, his mind was already working in ways he had tried to shut down, assessing threats, calculating options, planning approaches. It was like putting on an old garment you'd kept at the back of your closet, uncomfortable because it no longer fit perfectly, but familiar in ways that went beyond conscious memory, etched into the very fabric of who you were. He looked at Victoria and saw not just the woman before him, but layers of overlapping time. The girl she had been, the future they had planned together, the life he had chosen to abandon when he left for war. And now the past and present collided in that moment on his isolated property, demanding that he make a choice he knew would change everything again, that would force him to confront precisely those demons he had spent years trying to keep locked away. "Where is he now?" Simon asked again, his voice taking on that commanding quality that came automatically when he went into operational mode. Victoria provided an address in a neighboring town, explaining that Hudson was holed up in a cheap motel, too terrified to go home. Simon nodded slowly, already forming a plan, already transforming into something he had sworn he would never be again. The decision had been made, but the execution required something Simon had deliberately buried in the darkest depths of his psyche: the ability to return to that mental state where cold threat assessment and precise application of force became second nature. While Victoria waited nervously in her living room for the first time in years, allowing anyone into her personal space, Simon climbed to the dusty attic where he kept locked away things from his military past that he couldn't completely discard, but also couldn't bear to see. There were boxes of neatly folded uniforms, medals he never displayed, photographs he never looked at. And there was hidden under a loose board in the far corner something he hoped he would never need to touch again: a Beretta M9 that he kept clean and functional out of sheer habit, along with 3 magazines and a box of ammunition. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the gun, its weight simultaneously strange and terribly familiar, like greeting an old acquaintance you'd spent years trying to avoid. Simon disassembled and inspected the weapon with automatic movements his body remembered perfectly even after all these years, checking each component with the meticulousness that had been instilled in him during countless training sessions. Satisfied with its condition, he reloaded it, the metallic sound of the bolt being pulled sending a shiver down his spine. Not of fear, but of something more complex, a mixture of terror and familiarity that made him question who he really was beneath all the layers of isolation and attempts at normalcy he had built. He fastened the holster to his belt, covered the weapon with a light jacket, and descended the stairs where Victoria awaited his eyes, immediately going to the change in him, a rigidity in his posture, an intensity in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "Simon," she said hesitantly, "I don't want you to do anything that... I don't want you to hurt yourself or hurt other people unless it's absolutely necessary." He looked at her with an expression that was almost gentle, but had edges of hardened steel. "Victoria, you came to me because you need someone who can handle dangerous situations. I can't promise it will be clean or pretty, but I can promise I will do everything in my power to bring your brother back alive." The drive to the motel where Hudson Hayes was hiding took 40 minutes, mostly in heavy silence, broken only by occasional directions from Victoria and the sound of the old Ford's engine speeding along back roads that cut through the rural landscape. Simon used that time to do what he always did before missions: empty his mind of everything except the immediate objective. Transform fear and hesitation into laser focus. Build that mental state where emotions were placed in separate boxes that could be opened later, when the danger had passed. It was a process he hated, that made him feel like he was betraying his own humanity, but it was also the only way he knew how to function effectively in high-risk situations. When they arrived at the motel, a dilapidated establishment called the Desert Rose Inn, that saw neither roses nor desert, but had certainly seen better days, Simon immediately began to assess the terrain with a tactical eye. 2 possible entrances, multiple escape routes, line of sight compromised by poorly maintained vegetation. There were 3 cars in the parking lot besides theirs, and Simon memorized each one, including license plates and positions. Hudson Hayes opened the door to room number 12 after Victoria knocked and identified herself, and Simon saw a thin, tormented-looking young man, his eyes sunken in dark sockets, his hands visibly trembling as he gripped the doorknob. He was the living image of someone living under constant terror. And something in Simon, that part of him that still remembered how to care for younger soldiers under his command, felt an unexpected surge of protective empathy. "Are you Simon?" Hudson asked, his voice hoarse from stress and probably lack of adequate sleep. "My sister said you might be able to help, but I don't know. These guys are dangerous, man. They're not messing around." Simon entered the room, closing the door behind him and immediately checking the window, the exits, establishing full situational awareness. "Tell me exactly who we're dealing with," he said, his voice taking on that calm, authoritative tone that made people automatically respond. "How many are there? Where do they operate? Who's the leader? How much exactly do you owe and why?" The story Hudson told over the next 20 minutes was tragically commonplace. A lost boy who started using drugs recreationally, slipped into addiction, began selling to support his habit, and racked up debt when merchandise he was supposed to sell was stolen by users more desperate than himself. The organization he owed money to was run by a man known only as Dalton, who operated a methamphetamine distribution network spanning 3 counties. Hudson had until Friday, in 3 days, to produce $50,000, an amount that could easily reach $1 million, considering his complete lack of resources or prospects. "They said they're going to make an example of me," Hudson whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "They said they're going to find me no matter where I hide, and that when they do, they're going to make sure my death is slow enough for others to learn." Simon listened to all this with a neutral expression. But internally, he was processing options, evaluating approaches. The direct military solution, locating Dalton and neutralizing the threat through force, was tempting but problematic. These weren't insurgents in a foreign country where rules of engagement were fluid. This was American soil, with laws and consequences. But there were other ways to resolve conflicts, lessons he had learned over years of dealing with complex situations where brute force wasn't always the best answer. "Here's what's going to happen," Simon said finally, his voice carrying a certainty that made both Victoria and Hudson look at him with something akin to budding hope. "You're going to stay here, locked in this room, not opening the door to anyone except your sister. I'm going to have a talk with Dalton." Hudson paled. "Talk? Man, you don't understand, he's not the type to talk." Simon interrupted him with a look that carried the weight of years of command. "Everyone talks when the right circumstances are set. You leave that to me. But I need information. Where can I find him? What are his patterns, his routine?" Reluctantly, Hudson provided details. Dalton operated from a bar on the outskirts of town, usually showing up there every night around 10, always with at least 2 bodyguards. It was a start. Simon checked his watch, 4:15 in the afternoon. He had time to do reconnaissance, formulate a plan, prepare contingencies. He turned to Victoria, seeing concern etched deep in her features. "This will be all right," he said, and although he couldn't really promise that, something in the way he spoke made her want to believe him, because Simon Thatcher had spent years learning how to operate in impossible situations, how to find solutions where others saw only despair, how to apply deadly skills with precision that preserved life instead of taking it. The bar where Dalton conducted his illicit business was called the Rusty Nail, a dilapidated establishment on the industrial outskirts of a city that had seen better days, surrounded by abandoned warehouses and vacant lots where weeds grew through cracks in the asphalt. Simon spent the hours before nightfall meticulously reconnoitering the location, observing the site from multiple positions, cataloging movement patterns, identifying entry and exit points, counting how many people entered and exited and at what intervals. It was tedious but essential work, the kind of preparation that separated professional operators from impulsive amateurs who relied on luck and ended up dead. At 9:45 p.m., he was positioned in his truck 3 blocks away, wearing dark, but not suspiciously military clothing. The Beretta concealed under his jacket, but accessible in less than a second if necessary. His heart beat at a steady, controlled rhythm, but he could feel that familiar tension building in his muscles. Not nervousness, but readiness, his body preparing for the possibility of violence, even as his mind worked to find a solution that would avoid precisely that. When Simon entered the Rusty Nail at precisely 10:05 p.m., the atmosphere was exactly what he expected. Country music blaring from the jukebox, the smell of spilled beer and decades of cigarette smoke clinging to the walls, half a dozen patrons scattered at tables that looked like they hadn't been properly cleaned since the establishment opened. Dalton sat at a table in the far corner, strategically positioned to see the entire room. A man in his 40s, stocky but not overweight, with tattoos stretching up both arms and the kind of presence that made people automatically give him space. Two men flanked his table, both visibly armed if you knew what to look for, and Simon knew exactly what to look for. He walked directly to the table with measured steps, aware of how each person in the room reacted to his presence, calculating threats and potential responses in a split second. The security guards tensed immediately, hands instinctively reaching for hidden weapons, but Dalton lazily raised a hand that froze them in place. "You don't seem like someone who's here to drink," Dalton said, his voice rough from years of smoking, his eyes narrowing as he assessed Simon with the experience of someone accustomed to evaluating threats. "So how about you tell me what you want before my friends decide you're a problem that needs to be dealt with?" Simon pulled up a chair and sat down uninvited, a deliberate move that communicated he wasn't intimidated, but also wasn't being aggressive. "I came to talk about Hudson Hayes," he said directly, without beating around the bush or preamble. "The debt he owes you." Dalton laughed, a humorless sound that was more of a growl than a laugh. "Ah, little Hayes, stupid kid who thought he could play a grown-up game. What are you, his lawyer, social worker? Because if you are, you're wasting your time. 50,000 by Friday, or this kid learns that actions have consequences." Simon maintained his neutral expression, but internally he was reading Dalton like a book. He saw the posture, the tone, the way the man's eyes kept returning to assess him, trying to place him in a recognizable category. "I'm not a lawyer," Simon said calmly, "and I didn't come to negotiate the debt. I came to offer an alternative that benefits you more than killing a penniless addict who will never be able to pay what he owes anyway." This caught Dalton's attention. Simon saw in his eyes that glint of calculating interest that businessmen, even illegal ones, always show when they sense a potential profit. "I'm listening," Dalton said, leaning back in his chair and lighting a cigarette. What Simon proposed in the next few words was risky but calculated. He would offer to work for Dalton for a limited time, applying his specific skills to solve problems that criminal organizations inevitably face. Security, reconnaissance, perhaps dealing with competitors or threats that required a more sophisticated approach than brute force. In exchange, Hudson's debt would be considered paid, and the boy would be left in peace permanently. It was an offer that placed Simon exactly in the kind of situation he had spent years avoiding, using his military skills for morally questionable purposes, plunging into a world of violence and crime that went against everything he had originally sworn to defend. But as the words left his mouth, he thought of Hudson's terrified face, Victoria's tears, those young soldiers he hadn't been able to save in the distant desert. Perhaps by saving this boy, he could somehow balance the scales, redeem just a small piece of all the things that haunted him. Dalton listened with growing interest, and Simon could practically see the calculations happening behind those cold eyes, assessing potential value, weighing risks, considering the advantages of having someone with real military training in his organization. But before Dalton could respond, the bar door flung open and 3 men entered, moving with a purpose that immediately set Simon's instincts on high alert. These weren't casual patrons. They were operatives, possibly law enforcement, possibly a rival gang, impossible to say for sure, but definitely dangerous. The leader was a middle-aged man with a stony expression, followed by 2 younger men who possessed the nervous energy of those primed for violence. "Dalton," the leader said, his voice cutting through the bar's ambient noise like a knife. "We need to talk about the territory in Carroll County that you thought you could take over without permission." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, an electric tension causing everyone present to recalculate their position and proximity to exits. Dalton's bodyguards stood up, hands now openly on their weapons, while the newcomers assumed positions they had clearly practiced. Simon suddenly found himself in the middle of a territorial conflict between criminal factions, a situation escalating toward violence with runaway train speed. Dalton was trying to maintain his composure, but Simon saw sweat forming on his forehead, saw the calculation in his eyes as to whether he had enough strength to win this confrontation, or whether he should retreat. And then it all happened at once. One of Dalton's security guards made the wrong move, or was interpreted as a threat, and one of the leader's men drew his weapon with surprising speed. What followed were seconds of pure chaos, where time seemed to simultaneously accelerate and decelerate, where every detail became hyper-sharp as adrenaline flooded Simon's system. He moved on pure instinct, years of training taking complete control, his body acting before his conscious mind could process decisions. He knocked over the table, creating temporary cover, his hand already drawing the Beretta as he yelled at unsuspecting customers to duck. Gunfire exploded in the confined space, deafening and chaotic, and Simon found himself back in the place he feared most, where violence was not an abstraction, but an immediate reality, demanding an instant response. He returned fire with frightening precision, aiming not to kill but to incapacitate, his shots hitting arms and legs, disarming threats without taking lives. But even as he did this, part of him was screaming internally, horror at what was happening colliding with the need for survival. And in a split second during that chaos, Simon saw something that made his heart stop. One of the gunmen was pointing directly at where a young waitress was frozen in terror, and he knew he had perhaps half a second to make a decision that would determine whether she lived or died. Simon didn't think. There was no time for thought, only pure action born of instinct and training so deeply ingrained it had become reflex. He threw himself through the space between himself and the waitress, his body intercepting the trajectory of the bullet, meant for her a fraction of a second before it fired. The impact struck his left shoulder like a hammer of hot iron, explosive pain radiating through his entire body as the force threw him backward. He fell heavily, taking the waitress with him, shielding her with his own body as more gunfire echoed above them. Through the haze of pain and adrenaline, Simon heard screams, the sounds of people running, the noise of tables being overturned, glass shattering. And then, as abruptly as it began, the shooting ceased. The invaders had retreated, probably realizing the situation was too heated, leaving only destruction and blood in their wake. The waitress was sobbing beneath him, physically unharmed but traumatized, and Simon forced himself to roll onto his side despite the agony in his shoulder. Warm blood trickled down his arm, soaking his shirt. But he'd been wounded before and knew from experience that it was unfatal. The bullet had passed through soft tissue without hitting a major artery or bone. Dalton was kneeling behind what remained of his table, his face pale. One of his bodyguards was on the floor, groaning and clutching his stomach. The other had disappeared. Innocent customers were scattered across the floor or had fled out the door. And Simon, lying on the sticky floor of a criminal's bar, bleeding from a gunshot wound, felt something inside him finally break. Not physically, but psychologically, that last barrier he had maintained between his present and his past, crumbling completely. Suddenly, he was no longer at the Rusty Nail. He was back in that Afghan village, the smell of gunpowder and blood filling his nostrils, the cries of wounded men echoing in his ears. He saw Jimmy Rodriguez on the floor where the waitress lay, saw Marcus Washington where the wounded security guard groaned, saw the faces of dead friends superimposed on every person around him. His hands trembled uncontrollably now, not from physical pain, but from something much deeper. All the trauma he had pushed down, all the horrors he had witnessed, all the deaths he had failed to prevent, all rising to the surface at once like a burst dam releasing a devastating torrent. "I couldn't save them," he whispered to no one in particular, tears mingling with sweat and blood on his face. "I tried, but I couldn't save them. They trusted me and I failed." It was a confession he had never made aloud, guilt he had carried alone all these years, a weight that was finally crushing him completely. Dalton approached cautiously, something akin to genuine respect in his expression as he looked at Simon bleeding on the bar floor. "You just saved that girl," he said calmly. "Took a bullet for a complete stranger. That's not failure, man. That's the kind of thing heroes do." But Simon shook his head violently, that word, hero, cutting like glass. "Heroes don't let their men die," he said through clenched teeth. "Heroes don't go home when their brothers are left in body bags. There's nothing heroic about surviving when people better than you don't." It was the deepest truth he knew, the core of everything that tormented him. Not just the trauma of witnessing death, but the impossible guilt of having lived when others didn't. That unanswered question that haunted every survivor. Why me? Why was it me who came back when better, younger men with more to live for, stayed behind. The pain in Simon's shoulder was intense, but not debilitating. He had long ago learned to function through physical pain, to compartmentalize it, and continue operating. Dalton ordered one of his men to fetch a first aid kit, and as Simon allowed someone to improvise a bandage on his wound, his mind was gradually emerging from that spiral of trauma, pulling himself back to the present through sheer willpower. He closed his eyes and forced himself to breathe. A deep breath, holding it for 4 seconds, exhaling slowly. The technique the VA therapist had taught him. He repeated the process, and again, until the panic began to recede, until the ghosts became just memories again instead of superimposed reality. When Simon finally opened his eyes, there was a clarity in them that hadn't been there before. An acceptance, perhaps, or at least the beginning of one. "You're right," he said to Dalton, his voice hoarse but firm. "I saved that girl. And that counts for something, even if it doesn't undo the past." It was a small acknowledgement, but for the first time in years, Simon allowed himself to consider that perhaps his existence wasn't just a succession of failures and losses. Perhaps there was still purpose, still the capacity to make a positive difference, even if that difference was one life at a time, one moment at a time. He thought of Hudson, that terrified boy hiding in a motel room, hoping that a stranger with a violent past would somehow save his life. And he thought of Victoria, who had believed that there was still something good inside him, even when he himself didn't believe it. "Is the offer still on the table?" Simon asked, looking directly at Dalton. "My work in exchange for Hudson's debt?" Dalton studied him for a long moment, something akin to admiration in his expression. "You're crazy, you know that? You just got shot, you're bleeding on the floor of my bar, and you're still trying to negotiate for the kid." He shook his head, almost smiling. "But I'll tell you something. What I saw here today tells me you're the kind of man who keeps his word, who doesn't run away when things get tough. So yes, the offer still stands, but with a modification. The boy's debt is cancelled. No need for you to work for me. Consider it gratitude that you prevented a bigger bloodbath here tonight. You controlled the situation when it could have been much worse." Simon felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made him dizzy, or perhaps it was the blood loss. "Why?" he asked simply. Dalton shrugged. "Because even in my world, where there isn't much honor, I still recognize it when I see it. You weren't here for money or power. You were here for a boy you don't even know, because a woman you clearly still have feelings for asked for help. That's rare. And because," he added more quietly, "my son served in Iraq. He came back in a coffin 6 years ago. So when I see a veteran trying to do the right thing, trying to save lives instead of taking them, that means something to me." There was genuine pain in Dalton's voice now, humanity beneath the criminal persona he projected, and Simon understood that everyone carries their own ghosts, their own losses that shape who they become. Simon forced himself to stand, refusing assistance even as his body protested. He extended his right hand to Dalton, who shook it firmly. "Hudson is free and safe," Simon said, not a question but a confirmation. "Free and safe," Dalton confirmed. "And if he's smart, he'll use this second chance to fix his life." Simon nodded, already turning to leave, needing to get out of that place, needing to breathe clean air, needing to process everything that had happened, as he walked toward the door, leaving a trail of blood droplets behind him. The waitress he had saved, a young woman no more than 20 years old with eyes still wide with shock, caught up with him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. You saved my life." Simon looked at her, really looked, seeing not only her but all the lives he had protected over the years, all the successful missions he had forgotten because it was easier to focus only on the failures. "I'm glad you're okay," he said simply. And for the first time in a long time, that's exactly what he meant. The morning light found Simon sitting on his porch, his left arm in a makeshift sling, watching the sun rise over the distant mountains, with eyes that had seen much darkness, but now allowed themselves to appreciate the beauty of the dawn. Victoria had insisted on taking him to the hospital, but he had refused. The wound was superficial, he had treated worse in the field, and hospitals asked questions he preferred not to answer. She had stayed with him overnight, sitting silently while he processed everything, offering her presence without demanding explanations. Hudson was safe, the debt cancelled. A second chance given to someone who probably didn't deserve it, but who perhaps could use it to build something better. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but for Simon, it meant everything. "I spent years believing that the only thing I brought back from the war was destruction," Simon finally said, breaking the morning silence. Victoria sat beside him, 2 steaming cups of coffee between them. "I believed I had become nothing but a weapon, incapable of anything but violence. But last night, in the midst of all that chaos, I made a choice. I chose to protect instead of destroy. I chose that a life mattered more than my own safety. And that's something my comrades who didn't return would have approved of. They wouldn't give their lives fighting, just so I could come back and waste mine in isolation and guilt." These were words he had never spoken aloud, an acknowledgement that had taken years and a journey through his own personal hell to reach. Victoria gently placed her hand over his, careful not to hurt his injured shoulder. "Simon, you were always more than they tried to make you. The war may have changed you, may have left scars that will never fully heal, but it didn't destroy who you were inside. That boy I knew in Millbrook Falls, who always stood up for the weak, who believed in doing what was right, he's still there. Just older, more scared, carrying burdens no one should have to carry, but still there." Simon felt tears burning his eyes, but this time he didn't fight them. He let them come, let years of repressed pain finally find release, while the sun continued its patient rise, illuminating a world that kept turning despite all the individual suffering it contained. In the weeks that followed, Simon slowly began to rebuild connections he had severed. He attended dinner at Victoria's house, getting to know Hudson properly. A broken but grateful boy who vowed to use his second chance wisely. He started taking more jobs in the city, allowing small talk with clients to extend a little beyond what was strictly necessary. He visited the cemetery where his parents were buried and finally spoke to them, asking forgiveness for not being there when they needed him, thanking them for everything they had taught him. And he kept his appointments at the VA hospital. But this time, he actually spoke with the therapist, began to process trauma instead of just burying it. It was slow progress, painful at times, but it was progress. The scar on his shoulder healed, joining the many others that mapped the story of his life on his skin. But unlike the others, this one he saw differently. Not as a mark of violence, but as a symbol of choice. Of a moment when he decided that protecting life mattered more than protecting himself from pain. Simon Thatcher would never be completely free from the ghosts that haunted him. He would never forget the faces of the friends he lost. He would never completely stop questioning why he survived when others did not. But he learned that survival doesn't have to be just existence. It can also be purpose. It can be honoring the dead through how one chooses to live. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was redemption not in forgetting the past, but in using its painful lessons to create a slightly better future. One life saved at a time, one courageous choice at a time. They laughed at the silent man, Simon murmured to himself one afternoon as he worked in his workshop, building bookshelves for his family in town. They thought silence was weakness, that isolation was cowardice. But then they regretted it because they discovered that silence wasn't emptiness, it was control. It was strength saved for moments when it truly mattered. And when that moment came, the silent man stood up. Not because he was invincible, but because, even broken, he still chose that some things are worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth living for. It was his truth now, his imperfect but real peace. And as the sun set once more over Millbrook Falls, Simon Thatcher finally allowed himself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, he deserved to be alive to see it.